On July 1st, 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British Army suffered over 57,000 casualties in a single day, the worst in its history. The following morning, Douglas Haig, Britain's commander in France and Belgium, opened his diary and recorded his assessment as a day of downs and ups. The offensive did not stop, but what Britain ultimately chose to do with Douglas Haig after such catastrophic losses is one of the most extraordinary decisions in British military history. Since 1914, Britain, France, and their imperial forces had been unable to shift a German defensive line running from Belgium to Switzerland, entrenched, reinforced, and on ground the Germans had chosen. By mid-1916, France was in crisis. At Verdun, further along the front to the east, a separate German offensive had been grinding French divisions down since February, and France demanded Britain open a new attack to relieve the pressure. Haig had asked for more time. His preferred date was August 15th, when more artillery would be in position and the newest British divisions better prepared. But Joffre, the French commander-in-chief, refused to wait. The attack would focus on the Somme, a stretch of northern France where the British and French lines met, 6 weeks earlier than Haig had wanted, but with the largest army Britain had ever assembled. That night, Haig wrote to his wife that everything possible had been done to achieve success. Haig's plan assumed 7 days of artillery shelling would destroy the German defensive system before the infantry moved. But those defenses were 3 lines deep, reinforced with concrete, with dugouts 20 feet underground and wire across the entire front. Britain had less than half the heavy guns the French had deployed along the same front, and roughly 1/3 of its shells were defective and never detonated. Therefore, the bombardment that was supposed to clear the way had not worked, and the warning signs were already on Haig's desk. Patrol reports showed the wire was intact in places and the dugouts had survived. The picture was uneven, but it was there. Haig proceeded anyway. 10 minutes before 0 hour, the British detonated a mine under a German strongpoint, which was supposed to destroy it. But instead, it handed the German line 10 minutes warning that the attack was imminent. At 7:30 a.m. on July 1st, 1916, the artillery bombardment stopped, and the German soldiers emerged from underground, took up positions, and opened fire on the more than 150,000 men already crossing no man's land toward them. There were 11 British divisions on the left and center, 5 French on the right, and many of them were ordered to advance at a walking pace across up to 300 yards of open ground directly into the German fire. On the left and center, the attack was shredded within the first hour, but on the right, the French and British forces had broken through and taken their objectives. Whether the British offensive continued was Haig's decision, and Haig's alone, and he made it. That evening, he noted in his diary that varying fortunes must be expected on a 16-mile front. The following morning, with over 40,000 casualties already reported and the final figure still climbing, Haig wrote, "This cannot be considered severe in view of the numbers engaged and the length of front attacked." He ordered the offensive to continue. On July 3rd, when Joffre pressed Haig to redirect his attacks, Haig told him he was responsible to the British government for the British Army and would run it as he saw fit. Therefore, the following day, his order to his commanders was unambiguous: continue operations relentlessly and allow the enemy no respite. For 140 more days, they did, each attack buying a few hundred yards of ground and costing thousands of lives in the process, without ever breaking the German line. The Battle of the Somme ended on November 18th, 1916. 6 miles were gained in 141 days, with approximately 420,000 British casualties. Douglas Haig had ordered every one of those attacks, and he was still in command. From inside government as Secretary of State for War, Lloyd George had watched the casualties mount, and by the end of the campaign, his conclusion was firm. Haig was unfit for the scale of command he held. 3 weeks after the Somme ended, Lloyd George became prime minister. He was a liberal, but he led a coalition government that depended on conservative support to survive, with a breakaway faction of his own Liberal Party and junior backing from Labour making up the numbers. The Conservatives had made their position on Haig clear. He stays, but Lloyd George was not facing one obstacle, he was facing two. Since August 1916, while the Battle of the Somme was still raging and the casualties were still climbing, the king had been actively campaigning for Haig's promotion to Field Marshal. Lloyd George had pushed back, but the king had not. On December 27, 1916, less than 6 weeks after a campaign that had cost nearly 500,000 British casualties, Haig was promoted to Field Marshal. The king wrote to him personally, "I hope you will look upon it as a New Year's gift from myself and the country." If you're enjoying the video so far, hit subscribe. It really helps the channel. And keep watching, because Douglas Haig's story takes several more turns from here, and none of them go the way you would expect. In February 1917, Lloyd George called a conference in Calais. He had privately arranged with the French Prime Minister Briand and General Nivelle, Joffre's replacement as French Commander-in-Chief, what he intended to put on the table. Haig attended, and so did General Sir William Robertson, the most senior British military officer in London. Robertson had gone to Calais suspicious that the conference was not simply about logistics, but what Lloyd George had arranged with the French went further than either Robertson or Haig had anticipated. The French proposals would have handed all British operational command to Nivelle, reducing Haig to a figurehead. To Haig, it was constitutionally wrong. The British Army answered to the British government, not to a French general, and personally intolerable for a man who did not rate Nivelle in the first place. He wrote directly to the king, and the king's response removed any remaining ambiguity. His confidence in Haig was unbounded. Haig and Robertson agreed on the spot to resign together if forced to accept the proposal, and Lloyd George found himself facing the dual loss of both his most senior commanders, which his coalition government would not survive. So Lloyd George modified the proposal. Haig would serve under Nivelle for the spring offensive only, with British command protections written in. Haig accepted under protest, and the British War Cabinet expressed its thorough confidence in him, although their private notes said something very different. They did not consider Haig a clever man, and Nivelle had made a far greater impression on them. But then, in April 1917, the Nivelle offensive launched, and it failed catastrophically within a matter of days. Lloyd George had been forced into a compromise and watched it collapse. He had tried every available means to remove Haig, but failed. By mid-May 1917, Nivelle was gone, and Haig had full independent command again. He was already planning his next offensive. Haig's plan was Passchendaele, the Third Battle of Ypres. The objective was to break through the German lines in Belgium, capture the Passchendaele Ridge, and push toward the Belgian coast to neutralize German submarine bases that Haig argued were threatening Britain's supply lines. The War Policy Committee objected. The advance was too ambitious, French and Russian support was too weak, and the likely casualties would damage Britain's capacity to fight the following year. But the committee was divided and could not unanimously agree to refuse it. Therefore, Haig personally went before them and made a promise. This would not be a tremendous offensive involving heavy losses, and if it proved too costly, it would be stopped. The committee approved it on that promise. On July 31, 1917, the Passchendaele offensive began, and it was not stopped. It ran for 3.5 months, and by November 10th, approximately 275,000 British soldiers had become casualties, around 70,000 of them killed for just a few miles of waterlogged ground. The man who had already presided over 420,000 casualties at the Somme had just added over another 250,000. But the war still had one more year to run. And that final year was completely different to the previous ones. On August 8, 1918, the Battle of Amiens launched the 100 Days Offensive. The Allied advance that drove the German army back across France and Belgium until Germany signed the armistice on November 11th that same year. Between August and November, Haig's armies took 186,000 prisoners and more than 2,840 guns. The Somme had cost 420,000 casualties. Passchendaele had cost another 250,000. But Germany had surrendered, the war was over, and Haig had been in command throughout. Britain now had a decision to make about the man responsible for all of the casualties and the final victory. Britain's answer began with the honors process. Haig's initial offer was a viscountcy, the fourth rank in the British honors system, one below an earl, but he refused it. He regarded it as beneath him, and he would not accept any title without enough money to support the status it carried. On February 23, 1919, his aide Philip Sassoon arrived at Downing Street to negotiate on his behalf. Sassoon opened negotiations at £250,000. Lloyd George eventually settled at £100,000, approximately £6.7 million in today's money. The man who had presided over nearly 750,000 British casualties across the Somme and Passchendaele alone had just haggled his price out of the Prime Minister, who believed him unfit for command. The £100,000 arrived on August 6, 1919, and 2 months later, Haig became Earl Haig, the rank he had deemed worthy of his status. He had outlasted every attempt to remove him, secured every honor he had sought, and on January 29, 1928, he died aged 66, without ever being asked to answer for the catastrophic casualties sustained under his command. Lloyd George's war memoirs were published in 1936, 8 years after Haig's death. He wrote that Haig had been intellectually and temperamentally unequal to the command of an army of millions, and that the task had been far beyond his mental equipment. And then came the sentence that explained every promotion, every honor, and every pound. There was no conspicuous officer in the British Army who seemed better qualified for the highest command than Haig. So the man who had spent years trying to remove him could not name a single replacement. The Somme, Passchendaele, the Field Marshal's baton, the negotiated earldom, all of it had been possible because Britain had no one better to put in his place. Lloyd George had known it throughout. He just waited until Haig was dead to say it. History eventually gave Haig a different title to the one he negotiated. He had been decorated, rewarded, and honored while he lived. In the decades after his death, the public arrived at their own verdict: the butcher of the Somme. Did Douglas Haig deserve what Britain gave him, or was he rewarded for failures that were paid for in human lives? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if the question of accountability in the First World War interests you, the video on screen now follows the man who brought chemical warfare to the Western Front, and whether justice ever caught up with him. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.